So, welcome to the first session of For and Against the Avant-Garde, the genealogy of an argument. What does the term avant-garde really mean? When we come across a painting, book, or film that strikes us as particularly innovative, demanding, or productive, we call it, amongst other things, avant-garde. We tend to use the term loosely to indicate that what work is powerful, dynamic, or charged in some way. How have artists, intellectuals, and critics understood the term? How has it always had a positive connotation? Have there been moments where ambitious artists, intellectuals, and critics have wanted to avoid being seen as avant-garde? In this seminar, we will unpack these questions. In addition to providing an all-purpose account of the term in the broadest sense, recovering its formal and philosophical foundation, we will track a number of distinct artistic avant-garde variants as they developed in the European and American contexts over the course of the 20th century. More specifically, we will chart moments where European and American understandings of the avant-garde converged and diverged, reassembling a conversation that played out in statements, symposia, and essays by the most important artists, intellectuals, and critics of the period. The seminar will deepen and complicate our notion of the avant-garde, providing a textured and nuanced understanding of 20th century artistic and critical practice. The seminar will consist of two four-session modules. In Module 1, we will discuss the development of the historical avant-garde in Europe and its reception in America, focusing on a series of debates that took place in the New York-based literary magazine Partisan Review. In Module 2, we will consider the American and European fallouts of that debate. In addition to art-intensive sessions dealing with the test case of Dada and Surrealism as they did or did not influence the work of Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, we will consider a number of developments in art criticism, including the rise of the social history of art, discussions of the neo-avant-garde, and recent comments reconsidering the notion of the avant-garde as such. By the end of the seminar, participants will have a grasp on what the term avant-garde has meant to various people at various times, the range of commitments that have been associated with it, how its position has changed within the broader artistic, critical, and political landscape, and what its status is in contemporary discourse. Sam Sakharov is a PhD candidate in Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council Doctoral Fellow in the Department of the History of Art at Yale University. During the 2014-2015 academic year, he held an Andrew V. Mellon Foundation Museum Research Consortium Fellowship at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. His current research focuses on liberalism and aesthetics in post-war America. I will now hand the mic to Sam.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to you all. I'm so thrilled that you're here to participate in For and Against the Avant-Garde, the genealogy of an argument. Today's session will be a little front-loaded. I'm going to read prepared text that sort of establishes a couple of foundational concepts for us, including accounts of the historical avant-gardes, a definition of the avant-garde as such, and also some of the commitments and counter-commitments that we'll see ripple through the rest of the seminar. So I'm going to begin reading my text now. It's quite long, but it's important. Not every session will be this weighted on my side. And then after I'm done, we will open it up for discussion and discuss our second reading, which, as you know, is roundtable on the present conditions of art criticism. And during that portion of the seminar, I really look forward to hearing what you have to say, both about that text and about your interests in the seminar more broadly. I think that we'll have to leave introductions either to the end of this session or to tomorrow's session, just because of how much material we have to cover. So with that being said, I'll begin. On February 23rd, 2017, Stephen K. Bannon, Donald Trump's chief strategist, addressed the audience gathered at that year's Conservative Political Action Conference, or CPAC. Sitting next to then Chief of Staff Reince Priebus in the Potomac Ballroom at the Gaylord National Resort and Convention Center in Oxon Hill, Maryland, about a 20-minute drive south of the White House, Bannon described his agenda that he and the administration of the newly inaugurated president would pursue. He broke that agenda down into 3 lines of work. The first was a kind of national security, he explained. The second line of work is what I refer to as economic nationalism. The third, broadly, line of work, he concluded, rounding out the list, is, quote, the deconstruction of the administrative state, end quote. That phrase struck me, although perhaps for not quite the same reasons that it struck many of the commentators and pundits that I, like all of you, I'm sure, were following hour by hour online. While I, like them, thought that the phrase was an odd one to come out of the mouth of someone holding public office, it also seemed strangely familiar. To humanities students steeped in theory, it evoked Jacques Derrida, who laid out the principles of deconstruction in off-grammatology, as well as Herbert Marcuse, who warned against the administrative state in One-Dimensional Man. Although these first-plus associations were superficial and somewhat cheap, Bannon was talking about ending economic deregulation, ending economic regulation, not about metaphysics of presence. The sense of uncanny familiarity persisted. Unshaved, slouched, and dressed in black, having left his trademark army green Barber wax cotton jacket at home, Bannon struck me as a kind of Twilight Zone version of the romantic bohemian figure that had so often been cast as the hero in the desperate to the barricades narratives that together made up the history of the capital S struggle that I had followed as a student from survey to survey and seminar to seminar. Indeed, on another occasion, Bannon assumed that role, entering the capital S struggle explicitly. In an interview that Ronald Radosh, a professor of history at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, conducted at a book launch that Bannon was hosting at his Capitol Hill home on November 12, 2013, Bannon described himself as a Leninist. Shocked, Radosh asked him what he meant. Quote, Lenin wanted to destroy the state, and that's my goal too, Bannon explained. Quote, I want to bring everything crashing down and destroy all of today's establishment, end quote. That seemed very close to the kind of thing I had encountered, sometimes more eloquently, sometimes less eloquently, quoted in essays by scholars in peer-reviewed publications and repeated by professors and students in lectures and discussion sections. A casual commitment to opposition in the grandest sense, and most vague sense, I would add, studded with an allusion to a revolutionary figure abstracted from his historical context and repurposed for the benefit of who was dropping the name. This comment also seemed strangely familiar. Soon I started picking up other formal resemblances between what Trump and his Confederates were saying and what I had heard, admittedly in a much more enlightening context during my undergraduate and graduate education. Trump was, quote, a disruptor, an outsider, and a change agent. He ignored norms, broke rules, and flouted conventional wisdom. These were the same qualities that I had been told made good artists and good critics. Had my understanding been that superficial? In the 18 months since Bannon's CPAC speech, I have gone back and reread a number of primary and secondary sources that occurred to me during those moments of unexpected misalignment. In most cases, my initial impressions stuck. The same rhetorical moves that Bannon made on stage at the Potomac Ballroom had been made by many of the avant-garde artists and critics I revered most. That realization has been uncomfortable, but not unproductive. While it has forced me to call into question some taken for granted commitments, it has also allowed other long neglected commitments to become more apparent. This seminar, For and Against the Avant-Garde, the Genealogy of an Argument, deals with those commitments, both the taken for granted and the long neglected. Over the next 8 weeks, we'll work our way through 100 years worth of material, reconstructing step by step a conversation in which a similar questioning took place. Beginning today with a discussion of the historical avant-gardes, namely Futurism, Dada, Constructivism, and Surrealism, that emerged in Europe during the first decades of the 20th century, and tracking how those avant-gardes were received in the succeeding decades in America, both by artists and critics, we will begin to uncouple what I will, for a lack of a better term, call ambitious art making and viewing from the avant-garde premises many of us know so well, that I was stunned to see repeated again with a kind of perverse fidelity by someone like Bannon. By loosening that association, making room for practices and principles that are well represented elsewhere in our day-to-day lives, but for some reason receive little serious attention in our history and criticism, we will not only recover a history that has been, to a large degree, forgotten, but will also put ourselves in a position to ask what role aesthetic experience can or should play in our current moment. I do not mean to load the deck. If my characterization of the avant-garde seems strident, that stridency is part of an attempt to shake us out of one way of thinking and enable us to consider the avant-garde anew. If we arrive at a place where we feel that contemporary circumstances compel us to redouble our investment in avant-garde approaches, that is all well and good. We will be better off knowing what those approaches are and why they and not other alternative approaches are necessary. If, however, we arrive at a place where we feel that we would gain more by choosing one of those alternative approaches, we have cleared up a source of long-standing confusion, gaining a deeper and more textured understanding of what motivates our engagement with ambitious works of art. Before I begin the session proper, a few words about the seminar's title. The phrase "for and against" is meant to give a sense that there were, indeed, a number of voices at play throughout the history we will be dealing with. Since that history tends to be told monovocally, presenting one side of the conversation but not the other, getting a sense of the variety of those voices will be useful in its own right. As we move through the readings week by week, we will give each figure his or her due, asking what they thought, why they thought it, and what we think about it. The meaning of the term avant-garde is complex, but it will become clearer in a moment. The term genealogy is an allusion to On the Genealogy of Morals, a polemic. Like the 19th century readers Nietzsche was addressing in that work, I suspect that we too, quote, remain unknown to ourselves, although for somewhat different reasons. Victims of a blind spot that we can only correct by taking a historical view of our habits and tastes. Although my sympathies tend to fall on the opposite side of the spectrum than Nietzsche's, I agree with his premise that, quote, the value of our values should be called into question. And so for the next few weeks, we'll be doing just that. The term argument is, again, meant to emphasize the fact that there are cases to be made both for and against the avant-garde, broadly conceived, and that there are plenty of artists and critics whose practices we may find compelling who fall on all sides of that debate. We will start to get a sense of those practices and their place in the argument more broadly when we discuss roundtable on the present conditions of art criticism during the second half of today's session. Moving on. As I said, today we'll be discussing the historical avant-gardes. What does that mean? The term avant-garde was first used with reference to art by Henri Saint-Simon in a fictional dialogue between an artist, a scientist, and an industrialist that he published in his 1825 collection, Selected Writings on Science, Industry, and Social Organization, where he described artists as constituting a social vanguard. Quote, "We, the artists, will be your vanguard," he wrote. "The power of the arts is, in effect, the most immediate and most rapid of all powers. We have all kinds of weapons. When we wish to spread new ideas among men, we inscribe them on marble or canvas. We popularize them in poetry and song. We use, in turn, the lyre and the tabor, the ode and the ballad, the story of the novel. The drama is open to us, and through it, above all, we are able to exercise an electric and victorious influence. We address ourselves to man's imagination and sentiments. Consequently, we are always bound to have the sharpest and most decisive effect," end quote. Although this passage is interesting, and we may want to return to it throughout the coming weeks, the term avant-garde has a somewhat different meaning for today's art historians and critics. Today, the term tends to be used to refer to historical avant-gardes that emerged in Europe during the early 20th century, principally, but not exclusively, Futurism, Dada, Constructivism, and Surrealism. To structure our discussion, I propose the following working definition of the term avant-garde that I have assembled by picking out common traits described by the leaders of Futurism, Dada, Constructivism, and Surrealism in the primary sources that we were assigned for this week's reading. Here's that working definition. An avant-garde is an aesthetic movement led by a small, self-selected group that formally states its intention in a manifesto to pursue a goal, usually some kind of revolution, moving deterministically toward that goal using agreed-upon techniques, usually involving negation. The implications of that working definition and the meaning of some of those technical terms, like manifesto, revolution, determinism, and negation, will become clearer when we begin discussing the historical avant-gardes themselves. So, with introductions out of the way, let's turn to Futurism. And Patrick will see the first slide. I'm going to switch now to slide presentation, so you won't see me for the next little while. So, thank you. Terrific. The Italian editor and ideologue Filippo Tommaso Marinetti laid out the principles of Futurism in The Foundation and Manifesto of Futurism, which he published on February 22nd, 1909, on the front page of the Parisian newspaper Le Figaro. Establishing a precedent that we will see repeated in many other avant-garde manifestos, Marinetti presented the first half of the manifesto as a conversion narrative. Quote, "We stayed up all night, my friends and I, under hanging mosque lamps with domes of filigreed brass, domes starred like our spirits, shining like them with the prisoned radiance of electric heat." He wrote. Are people able to see the slide?
Sorry, there's a small problem with both the audio and the presentation. I might have to use another program.
Shall I pause here?
Wait, sorry?
Shall I pause or continue?
I think it's best to continue. I'm going to show it in a minute. I just want to say it.
No problem. So I'll continue with Marinetti, quoting from the manifesto.
Yeah.
Well, no problem. Quote, "For hours we had trampled our atavistic ennui into rich oriental rugs, arguing up the last confines of logic and blackening many reams of paper with our frenzied scribbling," end quote. Finally, they burst out into the streets, like proud beacons or forward sentries against an army of hostile stars. Then, after a moment of silence, they hear, quote, "the famished roar of automobiles. We went up to 3 snorting beasts," Marinetti continues, "to lay amorous hands on their torrid breasts. I stretched out on my car like a corpse on its briar, but revived once under the steering wheel, a guillotine blade that threatened my stomach," end quote. After his death and resurrection, he and his friends proceed to speed down the avenues. Quote, "The raging boom of madness swept us out of ourselves and drove us through streets as rough and deep as beds of torrents," he writes. And between gears, he let out the exclamation, quote, "Let's break out of the horrible shell of wisdom and throw ourselves like pride-ripened fruit into the wide, contorted mouth of the wind. Let's give ourselves utterly to the unknown, not in desperation, but only to replenish deep wells of the absurd," end quote. Just as he finished this declaration, Marinetti rolled his car into a ditch. Emerging from the maternal ditch, covered in factory sludge, playing out a second death and resurrection scene, this time feeling, quote, "the white hot iron of joy pass through his heart," Marinetti then listed the 11 principles of Futurism. "We intend to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and fearlessness. Courage, audacity, and revolt will be essential elements of our poetry. Up to now, literature has exalted a pensive immobility, ecstasy, and sleep. We intend to exalt aggressiveness, action, a feverish insomnia, the racer's stride, the mortal leap, the punch and the slap. We affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed. a racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes like serpents of explosive breath, a roaring car that seems to rise on grape shot and is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. We want to hymn the man at the wheel who hurls the lance of his spirit against the earth along the circle of its orbit. The poet must spend himself with ardor, splendor, and generosity to swell the enthusiastic fervor of the primordial element. Except in struggle, there is no more beauty. No work without an aggressive character can be a masterpiece. Poetry must be conceived as a violent attack on unknown forces to reduce and prostrate them before man. We stand on the last promontory of the centuries. Why should we look back when what we want is to break down the mysterious doors of the impossible? Time and space died yesterday. We already live in the absolute because we have created eternal, omnipresent speed. We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and a scorn for woman. We will destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. We'll fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic utilitarian cowardice. We will sing of great crowds excited by work, by pleasure, by riot. We will sing of the multicolored, polyphonic tides of revolution in the modern capitals. We will sing of the vibrant nightly fervor of arsenals and shipyards blazing with violent electric moons, greedy railway stations that devour smoke-plumed serpents, factories hung on clouds by the crooked lines of their smoke, bridges that stride the rivers like giant gymnasts, flashing in the sun with the glitter of knives, adventurous streamers that sniff the horizon, deep-chested locomotives whose wheels paw the tracks like hooves of enormous steel horses, bridled by tubing, and the sleek flight of planes whose propellers chatter in the wind like banners and seem to cheer like an enthusiastic crowd, end quote. Having set down these principles, Marinetti ended his manifesto with a few parting remarks. Quote, "It is from Italy that we launch through the world this violently upsetting incendiary manifesto of ours. With it today, we establish Futurism because we want to free this land from its smelly gangrene of professors, archaeologists, ciceroni, and antiquarians," end quote. Addressing his would-be followers directly, he continued, "Take up your pickaxes, your axes and hammers, and wreck the venerable cities, piteously." Looking forward to, at best, 10 years of production before other, younger, stronger men emerged to throw him and his colleagues into the wastebasket like useless manuscripts, Marinetti ended by looking forward to a moment when the movement itself would be violently swept away, replaced by its successor. Quote, "They'll storm around us, panting with scorn and anguish, and all of them, exasperated by our proud daring, will hurtle to kill us. Driven by a hatred, the more implacable, the more their hearts will be drunk with admiration for us," Marinetti predicted. Instead of fearing that prospect, he welcomed it, seeing it as part of the necessary and indeed inevitable forward movement of art. Art, he included, can be nothing but violence, cruelty, injustice. So each of the elements listed in our working definition of the avant-garde can be found in these lines. Marinetti is clear that the futurists are a small, self-selected group. He and his friends were alone the night Marinetti had his conversion experience, forward centuries against an army of hostile stars. Following that experience, he stated the goals of the group formally in the 1909 manifesto that I just recounted, stating that they intended to pursue revolution, which he did not define in detail, describing it obliquely rather, as associated with violence and involving a total break with the past. In their pursuit, they would be following a predetermined course of history, which Marinetti aligns with an idiosyncratic understanding of technology, which he naturalizes at various places as a beast, a horse, and a shark, and describes as an all-consuming force in other places, an eternal, omnipresent speed that should be surrendered to completely. Finally, Marinetti and the futurists would make their progress using agreed-upon techniques, about which more in a moment, that would be motivated by negation, the destructive gestures meant to wreck the venerable cities. The painter Umberto Boccioni echoed many of Marinetti's statements and gave a sense of how they informed actual works of art the next year in his futurist painting Technical Manifesto, which he published in the journal Poesia, which Marinetti edited. He began by recounting what he and the group came to regard as the first exhibition of futurist works. Quote, on the 18th of March, 1910, in the limelight of Chiarella's Theater in Turin, we launched our first manifesto to a public of 3,000. Artists, men of letters, students, and others, he wrote. Quote, it was a violent and cynical cry which displayed our sense of rebellion, our deep-rooted disgust, our haughty contempt for vulgarity, for academic and pedantic mediocrity, for the fanatical worship of all that is old and worm-eaten, end quote. After a few more words, including a brief aside in which he located the exhibition in what he called a formidable struggle, christening it the Battle of Turin, he set out to, quote, expound with technical precision the group's program for the renovation of painting. That program included a number of specific recommendations. Quote, the gesture which we would reproduce on canvas shall no longer be a fixed moment of universal dynamism, he explained. It shall simply be the dynamic situation itself. To capture that dynamic situation, the artist would not paint objects, quote, motionless before our eyes, but would rather take into account, quote, the persistency of an image upon the retina, recording moving objects as they, quote, constantly multiply themselves, their form changing like rapid vibrations in their mad career. A running horse, for example, would have not 4 legs but 20. Objects would shed their superficial fixedness in time and space and instead become, quote, persistent symbols of universal vibration. Conventional distinctions would be done away with. Quote, the suffering of man will be given the same interest as the suffering of an electric lamp, whose spasmodic starts would shriek out the most heartrending expressions of color. The eye would be freed from its veil of atavism and culture, and the viewer would finally realize that brown tints have never coursed beneath our skin, and that, on the contrary, yellow shines forth in our flesh, that red blazes, and that green, blue, and violence dance upon it with untold charms, voluptuous and caressing the human face that is yellow, green, blue, and violet. Finally, Boccioni stated that futuristic works would be painted according to the laws of divisionism, or what he called innate complementarianism. He insisted that that approach could not be learned and applied at will. Quote, our art will probably be accused of tormented and decadent cerebrals, he explained, taking preemptive aim at imagined detractors, but we shall merely answer that we are, on the contrary, the primitives of a new sensitiveness, multiplied hundredfold, and that our art is intoxicated with spontaneity and power. Having laid out his program for futurist painting, Boccioni ended his technical manifesto with 2 series of numbered statements, one under the heading, we declare, the other under the heading, we fight. Under we declare, he wrote, quote, that all forms of imitation must be despised, all forms of originality glorified. That the name of madman with which it is attempted to gag all innovators should be looked upon as a title of honor. That universal dynamism must be rendered as a dynamic sensation, and that movement and light destroy the materiality of bodies. Under we fight, he wrote, quote, against the bituminous tints by which it is attempted to obtain the patina of time upon modern pictures, against the superficial and elementary archaism founded upon flat tints, against the false claims to belong to the future put forward by the secessionists and the independents, who have installed new academies no less trite and attached to routine than the preceding ones, and, quote, against the nude in painting, which he describes as being as nauseous and as tedious as adultery in literature. Again, reading through Boccioni's manifesto, we can tick off each of the elements of our working definition one by one. There's a description of the futurists as a small self-selected group, the public of 3,000, driven together by their sense of rebellion and haughty contempt for their pedantic peers. There's a presentation of a formal statement, the technical manifesto itself. There's the intention to pursue a revolutionary goal, namely the victory in the formidable struggle. There's a commitment to determinism, the talk of moving objects, dynamic sensation, and persistent symbols of universal vibration, and the categorical rejection of all that is old and worm-eaten. There's the elaboration of agreed-upon techniques, the mandated laws of divisionism, and finally, there is the commitment to negation, the concluding refrain, against, 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 against. Patrick, if we can get the next slide.
Yeah.
Thanks. We can get a sense of what all this meant in terms of actual works of art by looking at a painting that Boccioni made the same year he wrote the Technical Manifesto. And that painting is The City Rises from 1910. A crimson horse charges across the middle of the composition. Painted in a mass of red and orange strokes, it tramples the figures in its path. In the foreground, two men struggle to steer it, grasping what seemed to be a blue rope or rail meant to direct the horse. But it breaks free and careens onward, its head bowed and its forelegs arched, as if it is preparing to make another violent forward burst. In many ways, the painting is a step-by-step illustration of the principles Boccioni laid out. Its subject is a running horse, its cross-canvas path charting history's predetermined course. The path is applied in multicolored divisionist dabs. Light bursts over figures and in some cases crashes through them, figuring a universal dynamism that seems to all but dissolve the yellow-shirted figure in the foreground. But in other ways, the painting indicates how many of Futurism's stated goals remained, for all the manifesto boasting, at best partially realized. The running horse is, after all, relatively static, a leaden red mass with 4 legs, not 20. With one or two exceptions, the figures are more or less coherent, each occupying a discrete pocket of space. The event depicted seems to be not the dynamic sensation itself, but instead a particular moment, isolable within a fraction of a second. And finally, for all the forward-looking celebrations of technology, technological allusions are remarkably few in the painting. With the exception of a cluster of smokestacks in the background, in the top right-hand corner, for instance, you can see there's smoke, Boccioni only alludes to technology obliquely by way of the horse, reverting to the same naturalized, that is to say pre-technological, tropes used by Marinetti. If we can get another slide. Indeed, in many respects, the painting is remarkably traditional. Though Boccioni spoke of an art that was, quote, intoxicated with spontaneity and power, his painting was preceded by a fairly conventional crayon, charcoal, and chalk study. Moreover, while futurists may have wanted to exert a proprietary claim to notions of the modern or the new, divisionism as a style was already more than 25 years old at the time Boccioni published his manifesto and painted his painting. The style was based on chromatic theories that Michel Eugene Chevreul described in his 1839 work, The Law of Simultaneous Color Contrast, which were developed into a painterly style by the Neo-Impressionists, like Paul Signac, who used divisionism as a technical term in the treatise he published in the mid-1880s. The style was then inherited by a generation of North Italian painters, the so-called divisionists, in the 1890s. The first, last, and only Salon exhibition of works by those Italian divisionists had already taken place in Paris in the fall of 1907. So in many respects, the movement had ended 3 years before Boccioni claimed the term in his celebration of the new style. These comments are not meant to sink Futurism outright. They're simply meant to help us see that we should not reflexively assume that the historical avant-gardes have a monopoly on many of the commitments we tend to associate with them. Another commitment we may want to stop reflexively associating with the avant-garde is a commitment to values that we would casually call progressive. You will recall Marinetti's enthusiasm for war, which he described as the world's only hygiene, as well as a scorn for women. When we use the term avant-garde to mean progressive, these tend not to be the kinds of values that we have in mind. Indeed, the first historical avant-garde was not only not progressive, it was fascist. Next slide, Patrick, please. No? Are you there, Patrick?
Sorry, I had just had a discussion here.
Sure.
So you want the next slide?
Thank you, please.
So, right.
Oh, thanks for dealing with this. We'll talk about it next time to make sure that there aren't hangups.
Yeah. So here it is.
That looks fine. It's okay.
Yeah.
Marinetti did not limit himself to writing poems. He also planned riots. He was incensed that Italy remained neutral at the outset of the First World War, furious that in doing so his countrymen were missing the opportunity that the war presented to bring on worldwide socialism. In August 1915, he wrote to his friend and fellow futurist Ardenio Soffici, quote, "A revolution will occur, and we will be the ones to start it in Milan with pistols," end quote. He sketched what that riot would look like that same year. Drawing a map of an urban square in Milan, he showed how a crowd of rioters would come down the Via della Pace, turn right onto the Via Manfredo Fanti, and begin rioting in front of the Casa del Popolo, punctuating the action with the word guerra, war. You can see it just on the lower right-hand side of the Casa del Popolo. Next slide. Thanks. When Italy did enter the war in November of 1915, it was Mussolini's Fascist Revolutionary Party, formed the same year that Marinetti drew his sketch, that most closely approximated Marinetti's goals. His support for Mussolini was well known and decades long. Mussolini called Marinetti, quote, "a fervent fascist," end quote, and in a 1922 interview, Marinetti described himself as, quote, "an ultra-fascist," end quote. In 1937, the Paduan futurist Corrado Forlin, who had joined the movement after reading Boccioni's book, Futurist Painting and Sculpture, Plastic Dynamism, photographed his sculpture, Il Duce, and mailed it to Marinetti with the phrase, "I could have put him in a more virile pose, no? Next time," written below. Corrado then dated the card using the fascist-era Roman numeral 23 April XV, noting that it was sent on April 23rd of the 15th year after Mussolini took power in 1922. While the other avant-gardes, historical avant-gardes, have records that are nowhere near this marred, they too depart in surprising ways from what many of us might mean when we use the term avant-garde casually. Slide. Thanks. In many ways, Dada could not have been more different from Futurism. The poet and scholar Hugo Ball, one of the movement's principal proponents, said that its aim was to remind the world that there are, quote, "independent men beyond war and nationalism who live for other ideals," end quote, a statement that placed him on the opposite side of the ideological spectrum from Marinetti. In other ways, Dada shared numerous characteristics with the other historical avant-gardes, Futurism included. Ball described the premises of Dada in a series of diary fragments he wrote between 1916 and 1917, during the most active years of the Cabaret Voltaire, a haven for exiled artists from across Europe that Ball founded in neutral Zurich, Switzerland. Given the scale of the horror presented by the war, he argued that the artists participating in the movement had no choice but to engage in total negation. Quote, "contradict the existing world orders," he wrote. Quote, "the bankruptcy of ideals having destroyed the concept of humanity to its very innermost strata, there remained only two positions, the blog or joke," that's B-L-A-G-U-E, not B-L-O-G, and, quote, "the bleeding pose." As that last phrase suggests, Ball thought that, in the current circumstance, artists were unable to engage productively with the world as it existed, and could only point to its absurdity while perhaps holding open the possibility of relief elsewhere. With that in mind, Ball appealed to a number of religious metaphors. Quote, "the word and image are one," he explained in a June 1916 entry. "Painting and composing poetry belong together. Christ is image and word. The word and the image are crucified." Quote. Referring to his own poetic practice, he continued, quote, "we have charged the word with forces and energies which made it possible for us to recover the evangelical concept of the word, logos, as a magical complex of images. Perhaps," he suggested in an entry from April 1917, quote, "the art which we are seeking is the key to every former art, a Solomonic key, that will open all mysteries." Ball explored the religiously inflected negation that would come to define Dada practice more broadly in his Poems Without Words, that he performed at the Cabaret Voltaire. On June 23rd, 1916, he performed a poem dressed as a magical bishop. Here you see it on screen. Recalling the performance years later, he wrote, quote, "My legs were in a cylinder of shiny blue cardboard, which came up to my hips so that I looked like an obelisk. Over it, I wore a huge coat collar cut out of cardboard, scarlet inside and gold outside. I also wore a high blue and white striped witch doctor's hat. I was carried onto the stage in the dark and began slowly and solemnly. Gary, Barry, Bimba, Landry, Lau, Lani, Corda." And he goes on. "Then I noticed that my voice had no choice but to take on the ancient cadence of priestly lamentation, that style of liturgical singing that wails in all the Catholic churches of East and West. For a moment, it seemed as if there were a pale, bewildered face in my cubist mask, that half-frightened, half-curious face of a 10-year-old boy, trembling and hanging avidly on the priest's words in the requiems and high masses in his parish. Bathed in sweat," he wrote, bringing his recollection to a close, "I was carried down off the stage like a magical bishop." In addition to confirming the religious dimension of Ball's diaristic entries, which rhyme in interesting ways with the conversion experiences described by the Futurists, his recollection of the magical bishop performance also speaks to another feature of the avant-garde that tends to be overlooked in our casual use of the term. While we tend to consider the avant-garde as activist or engaged, in many cases with good reason, we rarely appreciate the degree to which negation, which we tend to take as integral to critical practice more broadly, could shade into a passive and disengaged drive for transcendence and even escape. Next slide, please, Patrick. Am I reading too quickly? We're almost, I'm more than halfway through this prepared text, and I look forward to opening up for discussion.
I think it's perfect.
Great. Indeed, when the Cabaret Voltaire closed shortly after Ball's 1916 reading, he retreated from art altogether. Returning to the Catholic Church, he moved to the Swiss canton of Ticino in 1920, where he began writing Byzantine Christianity, 3 Holy Lives, which he published in 1923. He then began preparing his diaries for publication, completing Flight Out of Time in 1927, a few months before he died. Many of the themes that Ball presented in his diaries and poems were stated explicitly by the poet and essayist Tristan Tzara in his Dada Manifesto, which he read in Zurich on March 23rd, 1918, and then published in the journal Dada, which he edited. Quote, "Dada means nothing," quote, he wrote in one of the manifesto's subheadings. Indeed, the manifesto was in some ways both a manifesto and an anti-manifesto at once. Quote, "I write this manifesto to show that people can perform contrary actions together. I am against action, for continuous contradiction, for affirmation too. I am neither for nor against, and I do not explain because I hate common sense." Dada was born of a need for independence, he continued, of a distrust toward unity. We recognize no theory. Showing the same commitment to determinism that we mentioned in our working definition of the avant-garde, here giving it a dystopian rather than a utopian bent, Tzara included a short 3-line poem, quote, "Ideal, ideal, ideal, knowledge, 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 boom, 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 boom," presenting the move from idealism to science to war as, quote, a pretty faithful vision, presenting the, let me just pick that up, presenting the move from idealism to science to bombs as a pretty faithful version of progress, law, and morality. Having confirmed the movement's commitment to determinism, he then confirmed its commitment to remaining a small, self-selected group. Quote, "Art is a private affair," he explained. Quote, "The artist produces it for himself. An intelligible work is the product of a journalist. The artist and the poet rejoice at the venom of the masses. He is happy to be insulated. It is proof of his immutability. When a writer or artist is praised by the newspapers, it is a proof of the intelligibility of his work, wretched lining of a coat for public use, tatters covering brutality, piss contributing to the warmth of an animal brooding vile instincts, flabby, insipid flesh reproducing with the help of typographical microbes. What we need," he continued, redoubling his commitment to hermeticism, quote, is works that are strong, straight, precise, and forever beyond understanding. Let each man proclaim, quote, there's a great negative work of destruction to be accomplished. Freedom, dada, 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 a roaring of tense colors and interlacing opposites, and of all contradictions, grotesques, inconsistencies, life, end quote. And we'll go to the next slide. The themes that Ball and Zara pointed to were also present in the works of artists who were more loosely affiliated with Dada. Paul Klee, for example, who exhibited at the Gallery Dada in 1917, summed up certain elements of the movement, including its religiously inflected negation and its dystopian determinism, in his 1920 work, Angelus Novus. Pardon me. Walter Benjamin, who owned Angelus Novus, referred to the work in a passage from his thesis on the philosophy of history, where he used the work as a kind of icon for his own determinist and, understandably, dystopian account of history. Quote, a clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating, Benjamin wrote. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past, where he perceives a chain of events. He sees where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling up wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise, he continued, recalling the religious themes Ball raised. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly compels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris grows before him skyward. This storm is what we call progress, end quote. Although many of the commitments that Ball and Zara detailed were amended when Dada took root in Germany, where the movement became more politicized, becoming aligned with Bolshevism in particular, other commitments persisted unchanged. And what is Dadaism and what does it want in Germany, which was published in the journal Der Dada in 1919, Richard Husebeck and Raoul Hausmann laid out a program that was in many ways more actively engaged than that of their Swiss counterparts. Indeed, other Dada-affiliated German artists like George Grosz and John Hortfield actually joined the German Communist Party. But in other ways, however, indications of the same underlying tendency toward escapist passivity persisted. Although Husebeck and Hausmann listed Dada demands that included straightforward political commitments to, quote, the International Revolutionary Union of all creative and intellectual men and women on the basis of radical communism, the progressive unemployment through comprehensive mechanization, and the, quote, immediate expropriation of property, some of the other demands had the same religious overtones encountered in Ball, Zara, and Klee. Husebeck and Hausmann called for, quote, compulsory adherence of all clergymen and teachers to the Dadaist articles of faith, the introduction of the simultaneous poem as a communist state prayer, the requisition of churches for the performance of brutalism, simultaneous, and Dadaist poems, end quote. He also included a number of demands that bordered on the totalitarian impulses of Marinetti and the Futurists. They called for, quote, a state art center, the establishment of a Dadaist advisory council for the remodeling of life in every city over 50,000 inhabitants, submission of all laws and decrees to the Dadaist Central Council for approval, and most alarmingly, the, quote, immediate regulation of all sexual relations according to the views of international Dadaism through establishment of a Dadaist sexual center, end quote. These demands were underwritten by the overarching predetermined course of history, which, for Husebeck and Hausmann, led not to dystopia, but to utopia. In his first German manifesto, which he delivered in February 1918 and published the following year, Husebeck described that predetermined course, again using the vocabulary of religiously inflected negation. In a line that borrows equally from the Ascension of Christ and the Hegelian dialectic, he wrote, quote, a fabric tears under your hand. You say yes to life that strives upward by negation. Affirmation, negation, the gigantic hocus pocus of existence fires the nerve of the true Dadaist. And there he is, reclining, hunting, cycling, half pentangle, half St. Francis, laughing and laughing. Blast the aesthetic ethical attitude. Blast the bloodless abstraction of expression. Blast the literary hollowheads and their theories for improving the world. For Dadaism in word and image, for all the Dada things that go on in the world, to be against this manifesto is to be Dadaist, end quote. In his 1920 article on Avant-Garde, where he gave a retrospective account of the movement, Husselbeck continued this line of thinking, imagining the death of Dada and its afterlife elsewhere. In the closing lines of the article, he wrote, quote, "Death is a thoroughly Dadaist business, in that it signifies nothing at all. Dada has the right to dissolve itself and will exert this right when the time comes. But if Dada dies here," he continued, "it will someday appear on another planet with rattles and kettle drums, pot covers and simultaneous poems, and remind the old God that there are still plenty of people who are very well aware of the complete idiocy of the world," end quote. Here too, the activist agitation that we associate with avant-garde practice blurs into a passive cynicism that may not be so easily reconciled with our casual use of the term. Slide, please, Patrick. Thanks. Next, we will turn to constructivism. Although by far the most politically ambitious of the historical avant-gardes, many of the by now familiar complications occur here too. Vladimir Tatlin anticipated the principles of the movement in an unpublished 1919 essay, The Initiative Individual and the Creativity of the Collective, where he linked art with life, specifically, quote, life at the moment of change in the political system, that is to say, at the moment of revolution. The connection between art and life led Tatlin to develop a sober materialism that he called, quote, the culture of materials. Instead of looking for energy in forms that he had invented himself, an approach that he argued would have been illegitimate because it would have separated him as an individual from the collective, he looked for it in the tension latent in the materials themselves, which were concrete and common to all. In his corner counter-relief of 1915, for example, which is on screen, he constructed a complicated composition based on the weight and counterweight of the sheets of iron and lengths of wire that he used, balancing them against each other, creating a taut and energetically charged work that was materially sturdy and incredibly volatile. But here too, sturdy materialism bled imperceptibly into airy idealism. Installed in the corner of the room, the counter-relief took the place of the Russian Orthodox icon. Indeed, complicating our habitual association of invention with creativity, Tatlin stressed the most determinist elements of determinism, emphasizing the degree to which his compositions were driven by, quote, necessity, saying things like, not to the left, not to the right, but to the necessary, not to the old, not to the new, but to the necessary. Slide, please, Patrick. The most explicit representation of the blending of materialism and idealism was the monument to the Third International, which the Department of Fine Arts at the People's Commissariat for Enlightenment commissioned Tatlin to construct in 1919. Although the monument was never built, in and of itself an indication of the slip from materialism to idealism, a number of models were constructed and shown around Russia. The art historian and critic Nikolai Punin described the monument in a pamphlet published on the occasion of the unveiling of one of those models in Petrograd in November 1920, in commemoration of the third anniversary of the 1917 October Revolution. Quote, the main idea of the monument is based on an organic synthesis of the principles of architecture, sculpture, and painting, and was intended to produce a new type of monumental structure, he explained, uniting itself in a purely creative form with utilitarian form, end quote. The structure, he continued, was comprised of three elements, each of which was devoted to a separate function of the Russian state. Quote, the lower structure, in the form of a cube, moves on its axis at the speed of one full revolution a year, as intended for legislative purposes. You can see the cube down there. The next structure, in the form of a pyramid, rotates on its axis at the speed of light of one full revolution a month and is intended for executive functions. Finally, the upper cylinder, rotating at the speed of one revolution a day, is intended to be a resource center for the following facilities: an information office, a newspaper, the publication of proclamations, brochures, and manifestos. In a word, all the various means of broadly informing the international proletariat and in particular, a telegraph, projectors for a large screen located on the axis of a spherical segment, and a radio station, the mass of which rise above the monument. End quote. While he stresses the monument's functional qualities in this passage, breaking down the purpose of each element, in the next line, Poonen admits, quote, the details of the design have not yet been specified, reassuring readers that, quote, they can be discussed and worked out during subsequent elaboration of the monument's interior. Here too, the role played by determinism in easing the move from materialist to idealist concerns can be detected. Indeed, in the closing sections of the pamphlet, Poonen describes the monument as instantiating the Hegelian dialectic as such, proceeding by a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, or what he calls the collision of two movements that are mutually contradictory, higher and higher in a single transcendent spiral motion. Quote, the whole form oscillates like a steel snake, he writes, quote, constrained and organized by one general movement of all its parts to raise itself above the earth. The form wants to overcome the material and the force of gravity. The strength of the resistance is enormous and massive. Straining every muscle, the form finds an outlet through the most elastic and rapid lines, which the world knows, through spirals. They are full of movement, aspiration, and speed. They are taut like the creative will, and like a muscle tensed with a hammer, end quote. Convinced of the internal logic of Tatlin's design, which he implied would in and of itself hasten revolutionary change, Poonen concluded, quote, we maintain that the present project is the first revolutionary artistic work, and one we can send throughout Europe, end quote. Next slide, please, Patrick. Thanks. We can see the same slippage in which determinism allows constructivists to slide from materialism to idealism in the next stage of the movement's development. Following the unveiling of Tatlin's model, Alexander Rodchenko, who taught at the State Higher Artistic and Technical Studios, drafted both a list of slogans and an organizational program for the workshop study of painting in state arts and colleges. Among his slogans were, construction equals organization of elements, construction is a modern concept, and constructivist life is the art of the future, as well as the negative declarations, down with art as a beautiful patch on the squalid life of the rich, down with art as a precious stone in the midst of the dismal and dirty life of the poor, down with art as a means of escaping from life that is not worth living, quote. Among the principles of the program were that the workshop for the study of painting would have an educational and experimental function. Rodchenko described that experimental function in much greater depth in his program for the first working group of constructivists that he co-authored with Varvara Stepanova and published in August of 1922. In addition to making constructivism a formal term, its meaning had been imprecise up to that point, the document also announced a shift, inaugurating what they called, quote, laboratory work, end quote. Quote, the group of constructivists has set itself the task of finding the communistic expression of material structures, they explained. Quote, in approaching its task, the group insists on the need to synthesize the ideological aspect with the formal aspect, the real transference of laboratory work onto the rails of practical activity, end quote. In service of scientific communism, based on the theory of historical materialism, the group would engage in what they called real experimentation, exploring the internal properties of three categories, namely tectonics, factura, and construction. While the program also included a series of immediate tasks subdivided into the ideological sphere, the practical sphere, and the agitational sphere, in many ways it marked a retreat from the public concerns that Tatlin had at least planned to pursue in his never-built monument, which you will recall was, among other things, a mass communication tower. The result of the group's laboratory works were exhibited in the second exhibition of the Society of Young Artists, which you see on screen, in the spring of 1921, a month after Rodchenko had formed the Hermetic Working Group of Objective Analysis. Here, Rodchenko displayed his own hanging constructions, see the top right-hand corner of the photograph, which were studies in motion and dynamism, made from a sheet of plywood that he cut in a series of circular band-like pieces and reassembled to create maximum variability and fluctuation. These were shown alongside Carl Jonassen's wire constructions, see the lower left-hand side of the photograph, which were studies in balance, made from metal columns and wires that he arranged so that the structure stood using nothing other than the counter-levered force of each component. Although these studies were nominally in service of post-revolutionary society, meant to demonstrate principles that could be put into practice beyond the gallery walls, they were in effect formal studies, exploring on a theoretical level properties that could be isolated, observed, and developed in the laboratory setting alone. Next slide. Thanks, Patrick. Sorry, I have to pivot from a printout to an online thing. Just 2 seconds. Here we encounter a trait of avant-garde practice that is familiar, the sense that ambitious art can, should, or must. Oh, sorry, can we go back? Sorry, Patrick. Thanks very much. Here we encounter a trait of avant-garde practice that is familiar, the sense that ambitious art can, should, or must be pursued in a specialized setting, removed from the unpredictable conditions that complicate the wider world. While this certainly remains a compelling and perhaps convincing argument for the avant-garde as a distinct and privileged undertaking, it does not sit very easily with the rhetoric that the constructivists themselves had used. After all, Rodchenko and the other constructivists had argued that the legitimacy of art rested on the basis of its practical service to post-revolutionary culture. Though there wasn't enough time for that contradiction to trouble the constructivists themselves, they lost state sponsorship with the turn to socialist Soviet realism not long after the 1921 exhibition, and were forced to disband, in many cases taking up manual labor. The rift between an art that pursued theoretical concerns that were sanctioned by a promise of political efficacy remains. Indeed, perhaps in the weeks ahead, we should ask whether we ought to accept the simultaneous insistence on esoteric, lab-like theorizing on the one hand, and political efficacy on the other in contemporary work that we describe as avant-garde. Since the contradictions involved in that double insistence can easily become both self-defeating and self-depleting, maybe we should reconsider some of the demands involved. Great, now we're gonna have the next slide, and we're moving to our final avant-garde. The last historical avant-garde we will consider before opening up for discussion, and the one that has in many ways been the most impactful and the longest lasting, is Surrealism. The poet and essayist André Breton described the fundamental elements of the movement in his first manifesto of Surrealism, which he published in Paris in 1924. Quote, "The mere word freedom is the only one that still excites me," Breton explained. While that freedom was everywhere constrained, it was still available in the, quote, imagination. Quote, "Imagination alone offers me some intimation of what can be," Breton continued. Those with the most uninhibited access to their imaginations were the insane. Due to their profound indifference to the way in which we judge them, and even to the various punishments meted out to them, we are allowed to suppose that they derive a great deal of comfort and consolation from their imagination, that they enjoy their madness sufficiently to endure the thought that its validity does not extend beyond themselves, Breton suggested, before noting in an aside, quote, "And indeed, hallucinations, illusions, etc. are not a source of trifling pleasure." Citing the work of Sigmund Freud to somewhat peculiar ends, Breton refined his account of the imagination, associating it with the unconscious, describing, quote, "strange forces," quote, "deep in the mind that were," quote, "capable of augmenting those on the surface." Allowing the unconscious to take the place that technology had taken for the futurists, that absurdity had taken for the Dadaists, and that history had taken for the constructivists, Breton then turned the unconscious into a determining force that was powerful enough to allow him to escape what he called the reign of logic. As was the case with the other avant-gardes, that determinist turn, for all its activist promises, also brought its share of passivity. Quote, "I would like to sleep," Breton wrote, "in order to surrender myself to the dreamers, the way I surrender myself to those who read me with eyes wide open, in order to stop imposing in this realm the conscious rhythm of my thought. The mind of the man who dreams is fully satisfied by what happens to him," Breton continued. "Let yourself be carried along. Events will not tolerate your interference. The ease of everything is priceless." Systematizing the preceding reflections, Breton then looked forward to what he called the future resolution of two states, dream and reality, into, quote, "an absolute reality" that he called surreality. Breton then provided a definition of surrealism as such. Quote, "Surrealism, noun, psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally, by means of the written word, or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought, dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason, exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. Surrealism," he continued, now in the guise of an encyclopedia rather than a dictionary entry, quote, "is based on the belief in the superior reality of certain forms of previously neglected associations, and, quote, the omnipotence of dream," which he suggested in a totalizing mode, made possible by the deterministic turn, could be, quote, "substituted for all other psychic mechanisms," and was capable of, quote, "solving all the principal problems of life." Just note how complete the claim is on behalf of the unconscious, that could solve all the principal problems of life. As I said, Breton's determinist turn to the unconscious brought with it a degree of passivity. One way that passivity manifested was in the surrealist approach to artistic composition, the psychic automatism that Breton describes in his definition. In one passage, Breton describes composing, if indeed that is the appropriate term, a poem as he slept. Quote, "One evening, before I fell asleep, I perceived so clearly articulated that it was impossible to change a word, but nevertheless removed from the sound of any voice, a rather strange phrase which came to me without any apparent relationship to the events in which my consciousness agrees I was then involved. A phrase which seemed to me insistent, a phrase, if I may be so bold, which was knocking at the window." Having woken up, Breton resolved to incorporate that dreamed of phrase, which he now only dimly recalled, into his material for poetic construction. Quote, "No sooner had I granted it this capacity that it was in fact succeeded by a whole series of phrases with only brief pauses between them, which surprised me only slightly less and left me with the impression of their being so gratuitous that the control I had then exercised upon myself seemed to me illusory, and all I could think of was putting an end to the interminable quarrel raging inside me. I resolved to obtain from myself a monologue spoken as rapidly as possible without any intervention on the part of critical faculties. A monologue consequently unencumbered by the slightest inhibition, and which was, as closely as possible, akin to spoken thought," end quote. In addition to being arguably passive, that method of composition was also arguably escapist. As Breton noted in the last line of his manifesto, quote, "Existence is elsewhere." A figure who brought many of the premises that Breton outlined in his manifesto, including their passive and escapist elements, to the visual arts was Max Ernst. Like Breton, Ernst wanted to evade what Breton called the reign of logic via the unconscious. One way Ernst did that was by challenging the status of the rational subject. Indeed, he created for himself an alternate persona he called Dada Max. Ernst had been affiliated with Dada before Surrealism. Dada Max had borderline artistic qualities. Ernst made a number of collage self-portraits both by and of Dada Max, in which he assembled multiple displaced images in a manner that mimicked the workings of the unconscious. For example, in Untitled, The Punching Ball, or The Immortality of Buonarroti, from 1920, which is on screen now. He combined a photograph of himself, labeled Dada Max, along the cheek, with a composite figure of an image of a head, a composite figure comprised of an image of a head taken from a medical textbook, its skin removed, its veins displayed, superimposed on a female torso named Caesar Bonarotti, a name meant to personify the culture that Ernst, by assuming the Dada Max persona, hoped to elude. Next slide, please. Have we lost Patrick? There, thanks, Patrick. Ernst continued his assault on the rational subject in the master's bedroom from the same year. There he returned to the primal scene of the unconscious, the bedroom. Cutting images out of a children's study book and pasting them in an illogical order against a dramatically receding space, he sought to duplicate an alienated schizoid effect. Indeed, instead of mastering the images, using the study book to graduate into adult symbol use as intended, the images master him, exerting their own uncanny force as they stare back from across the empty room. And the inscription says, the master's bedroom, why not stay there for a night? Which is itself kind of an interesting partial invitation to engage in surrealist actions. Ernst supplemented his, oh, sorry, next slide, please, Patrick. Ernst supplemented his exploration of autistic and schizoid subject positions, unconstrained by logic, by reading works like Hans Prinzhorn's 1922 study, Artistry of the Mentally Ill, in which Prinzhorn identified 6 drives that he argued were present in schizophrenics and that determined artistic production as well. As the frontispiece of Prinzhorn's study, a watercolor showing the angel-assisted ascension of Marie de Medici implies, even this scholarly fascination with the mentally ill was tinted by a by now familiar desire for religiously inflected escape. Ernst used Prinzhorn's study to delve deeper into the schizophrenic sources he tapped in his earlier work. In his autobiography, Beyond Painting, he described how he mimicked schizophrenic habits as a student at Bonn University, which was among the first universities to have a department of psychology. Only later, he wrote, referring to his encounter with Prinzhorn's work, did I, quote, discover certain procedures that allowed me to penetrate into the no man's land of the insane. Next slide, please. And we're almost done. Ernst made the religiously inflected dimension of the surrealist turn toward the unconscious most explicit in The Immaculate Conception, a collage he included in his work, The 100 Headless Women, which he published in 1929. Here he depicted a large bald head appeared atop what appears to be a complex mechanistic organ, perhaps communicating with or hallucinating the nude woman reclining below. Again, what is striking here is how passive the process of artistic composition has become, something many of us do not associate with the avant-garde, broadly and casually understood. For all Breton's insistence on the artist escaping the reign of logic, Ernst seems to suggest that the compositional process is, in addition to being divinely inspired, the result of what seems to be a series of rigorously determined actions. Next slide, please. Even in the pendant image, the not quite immaculate conception, that process seems to be just as predetermined, albeit in this case by forces that are not understood. And sorry, we'll have the next slide. Thanks. Indeed, in his foreword to The 100 Headless Women, Breton emphasized how Andre Breton, who's now writing the foreword to Max Ernst's book, Breton emphasized both the religious and passive aspects of composition, reiterating many of the themes discussed above. Quote, one awaited a book that would take into account the drastic exaggeration of those salient lines emphasized by the attenuation of all others, Breton explained. A book whose author had the drive needed to bring him to the top of the precipice of indifference, where a statue is far less interesting on its pedestal than in a pit, where an aurora borealis produced in the magazine Nature is less beautiful than in any unexpected elsewhere. Surreality, as Breton had realized it in his collection of collages, would be, Breton continued, making explicit the escapist implications mentioned above, quote, the means of our total evasion, end quote. Indeed, Breton was so impressed by the 100 Headless Women and the Immaculate Conception in particular that he used it as a title for a volume of poems that he co-authored with Paul Edouard the next year. Written as a simulation of various psychic disorders, the volume was meant to permit the reader to free him or herself from the reign of logic and surrender to the forces of the unconscious, allowing it to compose and recompose visions unconstrained by his or her critical faculties. At the same time as they were making these appeals to religiously inflected determinism, the Surrealists were also increasingly aligning themselves with communist revolution, a concept that their religiously inflected appeals did not contradict. Here too we find the assertion of political efficacy being countermatched by the retreat from what many of us would conventionally regard as the arena of political action. For example, in his Declaration of the Bureau of Recherche Surrealists, the Declaration of the Bureau of Surrealist Research, which he issued on January 27th, 1925, Louis Aragon, a friend of Breton's and former medical student, set out to rebut what he, speaking on behalf of all Surrealists, described as, quote, the false interpretation of our enterprise that were being stupidly circulated among the public. Quote, we are determined to make a revolution, he explained, rather vaguely. Quote, we have joined the word surrealism to the word revolution to solely show the disinterested, detached, and even entirely desperate character of that revolution. As he explained, that revolution would be entirely negative. Quote, we make no claim to change the mores of mankind, but we intend to show, rather, the fragility of thought, and on what shifting foundations, what caverns we have built our trembling houses. We hurl this formal warning to society, he continued, making explicit the antagonism between the Surrealists, conceived as a small group, and the stupid public he chastised in his opening remark. Quote, beware of your deviations and faux pas. We shall not miss a single one. At each turn of its thought, society will find us waiting. We are specialists in revolt, end quote. And next and last slide. The same countermatching can be seen in the second manifesto of Surrealism, which Breton, having broken with many of his colleagues, published in the final issue of La Révolution Surrealiste in December 1929, sounding, at which point he would found the breakaway journal, Surrealism in Service of the Revolution, the following year, 1930. While his commitment to the revolution became ever stronger, it was inflected by other, seemingly contradictory, though perhaps perfectly homologous commitments, including his antagonism toward the real, his invocation of an artistic, quote, state of grace, quote, and his insistence that works of art must, quote, follow a purely internal model, end quote. In the second manifesto, Breton recapitulated many of the elements included in our definition of the avant-garde. Now presenting Surrealism as an instantiation of dialectical materialism, he described it as, quote, an exercise in, quote, negation, and the negation of the negation. The Surrealist was to give himself over, quote, completely, without any reservations, to that exercise, and was to protest neither against, quote, poetic determinism, nor against, quote, the dialectic of materialism, both of which Breton regarded as, quote, evolutionary modes, the value of which lay in their being, quote, unsparing. Quote, these products of psychic activity, he concluded, referring to the techniques that he had outlined earlier in the manifesto, as far removed from the desire to make sense, as free as possible of any ideas of responsibility, which are always prone to act as brakes, as independent as possible of everything which is not the passive life of the intelligence. These products, which automatic writing and the description of dreams present, quote, a key capable of opening indefinitely that box of many bottoms called man, a key that dissuades him from turning back for reasons of self-preservation when in the darkness he bumps into doors locked from the outside, of the beyond, of reality, of reason, of genius, and of love. Okay, so with that, that's been altogether too much from me. With that, I'll end my much too long portion of today's session and turn it over to the group for discussion. So our second reading, Roundtable on the Present Conditions of Art Criticism, published in the Art Critical Journal October, deals with, among other things, the afterlives of some of what I presented this session. In it, we find some participants endorsing the avant-garde, indeed at times on precisely the grounds that I have laid out rather disparagingly, and others being more skeptical of it. What I'd like to do is to have members of the group describe some of the positions taken by the participants, and perhaps reflect on whether they find those positions convincing, unconvincing, etc. Also, of course, feel free to take issue with anything that I've said so far. But with that, does everybody have a printout of the roundtable? Do you have the text available? Or do you recall what was said?
Well, just for myself, I just joined the seminar yesterday, so I'll just be listening at this point, catch up on the reading. So that's just
great.
Yeah, just so you know. No.
Yeah, thank you. Do people have, the rest of the participants have the reading available to them? Yeah. Okay, so why don't we just take a shot at, are you able to speak into the mic as well? No?
So let's do the old game of starting from left to right, and I think the first person on the left would be Artemis.
I think what you can do, just to get it started, is if you like, pick a figure from the roundtable and just give a sense of what their attitude was, just casually. And if there was a participant that you found particularly compelling, or one that you understood particularly clearly, maybe just say a few words for those who haven't read the text about what that participant said.
Hello. Yeah, first of all, I would like to say that unfortunately I haven't read it, the whole of it, so I don't have a whole idea of it. I have the text, but I didn't finish it.
Okay.
I would like to comment that I find avant-garde itself a criticism on the situation, on the each situation that we're living. It's an act that needs to criticize the life and manifest. So it has actually, a self criticism. I don't know how to say it in English. It's a double act, I would say. That it creates new things, but at the same time, it's critical about something. What other? I have some notes. Yeah, and I would say that it's actually it's a need to have in every situation an avant-garde, because either there is crisis, so we need a change, or either we are in a prosperity and it's too silent, so we need something to shake and shift the things and do something.
Great. Okay. So fantastic. So I don't quarrel with that sentiment. What we will see throughout the rest of the readings and the conversation that we'll be recovering together is a tension between the call to be critical, which I think virtually every figure we come across will share, and how best that criticism can affect a context broader than the avant-garde. So there is a question when you're quite rightly saying that the avant-garde is necessary because of a broader condition, whether it be a condition of crisis, of complacency, etc. But that sets up a relationship between the avant-garde and something beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that one of the questions that we'll be asking is what are the terms of that relationship? So what you'll find when you do get to the roundtable is really that question becomes central. Some figures will say the avant-garde only really has an obligation to itself, and the extreme side of that would be that the avant-garde should avoid being polluted by the broader situation. And you'll find other figures saying that no, if the avant-garde is to make good on its claim to respond to a situation that calls it into being, then it can't be alienated. It can't proceed purely by way of negation. It can't be purely critical. So that's one of the really sort of broad questions that we'll come to again and again. Does anybody else have anything to say about that, or how they, maybe if they haven't read today's readings, how they've encountered that tension before? It's a pretty broad issue that I'm sure has come up for you in a lot of different contexts.
Lately, I'm pretty skeptical about ideas of avant-garde, because I don't think, like, by now, I think it's too commodified. Like,
Sorry,
I don't think.
Eduardo, can you place your face a little bit out of the frame so we can, so we
I can hear you well, though. It's too commodified. I hear you.
Yeah, but we want
Like
his face.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's too commodified. Like, I think by now it does anything to society, because the situation, as you were like mentioning before, is like Trump has the same characteristics as an avant-garde artist. So by now we have like a process of total deterritorialization. So like avant-garde makes nothing. And it's interesting because some months ago, Nathaniel Dorsky came to Mexico. He's like this 70s avant-garde filmmaker working on 16 millimeters. And like we asked him, he was like still consider himself part of the avant-garde of the States. And he said something like, what we needed to do in the 60s is totally different than what is needed to be done today. So like, if there was like a sense of disruption, of need for disruption in the 70s, like by now we should find other ways of reconfigurations. And like, he used other words, I'm just paraphrasing. But
yeah,
that's what I found pretty skeptical about any need for an avant-garde right now, because by now it's everywhere.
Great. Yeah, so you're pointing to a lot of interesting things that will be following throughout the course. So one of the things you're pointing to is the notion that the avant-garde varies over time. That the avant-garde has a historical is context bound. So some of the principles that were laid out at one moment of the avant-garde's existence, for instance, in the moment of the historical avant-garde, may not apply in later moments. That admission is also made in the roundtable. The other interesting thing that you raise is whether the artist that you mentioned, the filmmaker, seemed to be saying that art making today in order to be effective in whatever sense, has to abandon certain avant-garde qualities. One of the things that I want to do throughout this course is to be able to grant that without saying that art stops being critical. We need to, I think, be historically specific about what we mean when we say avant-garde, so that when we do admit that certain avant-garde techniques, like negation perhaps, have to be abandoned, we're not at the same time giving up a claim to criticality. I think that also speaks to the first comment. We'll see a lot of artists, as I mentioned, and critics, who in fact insist on critical efficacy and use that insistence, or see that insistence as a reason to give up elements of the avant-garde, which are inhibiting their effectiveness as critics. So interesting, thank you. Yeah, fantastic. Are there any other, I'd love to hear other comments as broad as you like.
Yeah, well, one thing I was just thinking about in terms of this dynamic, right? This seems to be sort of a perennial political form, the avant-garde as you've defined it, as self-selecting, manifesto producing, revolutionary, determined, negative, and technically specified, right? Because the other side of all these things is something like social thrownness, right? Just belonging to a group collective you're born into. Instead of a manifesto, you have the literature of the they, whoever that is going to be, at a time, revolutionary versus quietist, or kind of like conservative in the same way that also negative and positive they're linked up, right? Like you're going to positively maintain the social boundaries that you have. And then this question, I guess, of like unspecified technique, just sort of like, oh, there's not that sense of like, this is what collectivizes us as a revolutionary collective. And then this question of freedom, I guess that's the one I'm not sure what the opposite is, since I think this question of determination or determinism is sort of like a theological category almost. And that's why I think so much of this feels so religious and the way these collectives form is they're heterotopic. They're trying to get outside the world and reinvent it. And so there's something apocalyptic, of course, almost about these things. But so it's interesting just to see like, yeah, this is going to be something that's going to appear everywhere, just based on what it means to keep a collective together versus have a collective be pushed on or fall apart or be negated. So that was just my general like formal comment.
Yeah, so you'll see a lot of those initial a lot of the themes that you're intuiting will come up very, very explicitly in the later readings. Again, so one of the things that this course does is it follows a conversation chronologically. And when we move from Europe to America starting next week, you'll see artists and critics begin to uncouple ambitious, artistic, and critical practice from a lot of those traits that we discussed. And the questions of what the implications of that uncoupling are, for instance, like, do you become conservative? Do you become sort of a cheerleading member of a group that you were born into? A lot of those questions will be raised and dealt with very, very explicitly by a group who started out sharing a lot of sympathies with avant-garde radical artists. So a lot of those questions you'll see figures actually answer in real time in the readings. Excellent. Yeah, great.
Yeah, I was also just going to mention here, just a follow-up to the last comment and related to Bannon, is just, of course, thinking about memes, like memes as like the cultural aesthetic of like the alt-right in the American context right now, and I assume elsewhere where rightism is on the rise. Just how there's so much avant-garde proliferation through memes right now, and so that's just something I wanted to throw out there at the beginning because I'm sure it's going to come up. So.
Okay, so if there aren't any other comments about the readings themselves, I will say that next week I will expect to deal in pretty granular, in a pretty granular way with the texts. So please do have them printed out with you and be able to refer to them in detail. But yeah.
Yeah, I do have comments about the text. It's just that I didn't read it, I didn't read the names. So I just read like the body of the text. So I was not able to but
sure, if you want to make comments, I'm also just to finish the thought, I'm also open to talking about the premise of the course, including the contemporary events. But sorry, Eduardo, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to address another issue that it was really interesting to I don't know, to see it written at which is how magazines and all these cultural institutions give value and build careers of artists. And I don't know, I think it was interesting because then they mentioned something it's coming from going from art criticism to fashion magazines or something like that.
Oh, you're talking about the roundtable.
Yeah.
Yeah, great, excellent, yeah. Yeah, so just for everybody else, Eduardo's pointing to passages where some of the figures in the roundtable are bemoaning the fact that so many of the art magazines, like Art Forum, have become either witting or unwitting appendages to the fashion industry. They are mainly promotional materials for galleries. So, and this, Eduardo, speaks to your other comment about the commodification of the avant-garde. Do you remember what the counter-argument was in the roundtable? The critic and art historian Robert Storr takes an interesting position with regard to the commodification of art writing. Do you remember what his take on it was? He says that he sort of, I don't want to, feel free to reread it, and I wouldn't want to speak for him, of course, but he implies that may be a price that has to be paid in order to gain a dialogue with a public. So the idea of a broad public was something that was batted around in the historical Avant-Garde manifestos we read. In some moments, there's the ambition to reach that public. That's associated with the political efficacy of avant-garde art. You think of Hadlin's Tower, which, as I said, was a mass communication platform. In other moments, there's a rejection of that public. And so the question of art's relationship to or ability to communicate with the public is going to be an enduring one. And one of the things that Robert Storr says again and again, and I feel like I can find passages and read them, is that one has to allow for a change in format when you do address the public, which may involve engaging with the market, which may involve changing your critical idiom and speaking in a, what he calls a belletristic or literary way, rather than a technical or theoretical way. I'll go ahead and actually just grab one of those passages. If somebody else wants to just pick up the reins of the discussion for 30 seconds, I'll find it. Oh, okay, ready? I have it. So on page 203, Storr writes, quote, "If criticism is not being taken seriously, part of the fault may be that the things being said, or at least the language and style that are used to say them, are no longer effective or useful. If you want to procure certain kinds of arguments, pursue certain kind of arguments, and make certain kinds of cases, you must realize that many younger artists are disenchanted by the assumptions and tones of criticism that dominated the 70s, 80s, and to some extent the early 90s. So the manner in which questions are raised is fundamentally important, but writerly approach and critical language are just important. If you fail to respond, if you fail to get a response nowadays, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are totally unconcerned with the basic issues being addressed. It may just be a problem of how they are being addressed. So that's Rob Storr talking about the mode of address and younger artists. And then there are also passages where he talks about the mode of address and the public. So I'll find one of those passages. There's so much great stuff in here. I really encourage you, if you haven't read it, really do look through it. It's I think, one of a watershed and kind of classic text. Sorry, I've got things earmarked here. Okay, so here we go. So this is on page 212, and again, it's Robert Storr. I'm just picking up mid-conversation. Quote, "There are, to be sure, many styles of criticism and many ambitions or projects for criticism. But if you begin to think in terms of having lost out in some definitive way, or of being outnumbered and surrounded by hostile forces, namely the public or the market, you have to consider whether or not you have competed as actively as you could have for the public that exists, and that you profess to want to influence in a positive fashion. So in that comment, and there are other comments like it, Storr raises the prospect that if you do in fact want to be efficacious, which so many avant-garde artists and critics claim, you may have to make concessions. There may be an element of compromise involved in reaching the public. Now, in some ways, that is a very common sense allowance. And I think that it should cause us to question why making that common sense allowance seems so heterodox. How totalizing has the avant-garde been in discourse that a claim like that, which seems to be so moderate, should be taken as radical in its own right? I think that is a very open question. What do people think about that, about the prospect of the avant-garde artist or critic claiming on the one hand to be politically efficacious, and on the other hand being unwilling to make concessions to reach a public? Do people have a view on that? Artemis, do you have a take on that?
Yeah, I would say that it actually acts like narcissistic, let's say, way that actually neglects itself. Like if you don't have the will to make a change in the actual world and only refers to art or even your new idea and yourself, it makes no sense. You just have want the attention of it. Of course, it's interesting because you're not acting politically. I mean, you have, when you claim yourself as an avant-garde, you have a political sense, but you're not using political terms to do it. So that's the interesting part of avant-garde in art. But if you don't engage with the public and you don't make some political move, it's actually like erases the intention, let's say.
Yeah, fabulous. I think that is so, again, this is a kind of, in some ways, a basic ground floor comment, but it is made so rarely in ambitious art criticism that one, again, has to ask why. So one of the things that you mentioned in your comment that I find fascinating is the prospect of being, you call it a narcissism, a self-reflexivity, not in a positive sense, but in a hermetic sense. And what is so interesting is that that claim has been made against formalist art making. So we'll get to Greenberg later, and ideas of medium self-reflexivity and self-reference. But what your comment is implying is that, in fact, that same self-referencing, that same hermeticism, is also present in avant-garde art criticism that claims to be post-formalist. I think that that is another interesting piece of the genealogical trajectory, that habit of self-reference was inherited by a camp that saw itself as being completely opposed to its predecessor, which is not to degrade any of the people involved. It's just to begin unpacking how we got to where we are, where you can make that comment. So yeah, fabulous, excellent. I think another great broad question to raise, and it's something that I don't want to answer myself, but I'd like you to answer, is what it means to act politically. We'll be using that term a lot. And I think it's important just to begin, or to allow that question to hang in the air. Because of course, a lot of these critics in the roundtable, the critics who take a position opposing Storr, would claim that they are political, and would claim that by not making concessions, they are in fact being political. But how do you understand that term? I think that is a very complicated and open question. So anybody who wants to jump in, feel free.
I have some perspective about that, considering that Mexico has just like become a socialist country, like.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that what is really interesting is that to act politically can have different layers. And what I mean by this is like what is to make political art, to make propaganda art, and people believe that's political art, but then that art is like really easy to be commodified. So this for like how Mexico works is like they give a lot of money to people that are willing to criticize the government, which is like really, really problematic, because then what is to be political?
So the state funds art that is critical of it, but retains a repressive relationship to that art.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so and you also mentioned, so you kind of mentioned two, and this is useful, two, broadly speaking, maybe poles on a spectrum of what it means to be political as an artist. One is propaganda, which is direct activism. Maybe that speaks to, John, your the notion of being positive as opposed to negative, and the other is critical. So maybe there, I'm not sure if we want to retain that, but it seems like anything we can do to start giving shape to the landscape in which a term like political is used in the arts would be helpful. So do people think that those poles are applicable? A propagandist art that advocates a position and a critical art that calls into question a position? Those might be two, broadly speaking, avenues.
Well, I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. You.
Go ahead, John.
Okay. No, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, I think the pole you're outlining here, I think on the one end of it is more of like along this narcissistic hermetic spectrum, right, which is an attempt to secede from the political altogether, right? And you see people still do this all the time. They'll say, "Oh, I'm not political. I'm just doing art." And it's like they're sort of imagining a utopian outside to the political, where they can just step outside of relations to the other, rather than realizing that that very act itself is somehow, I think, inextricably bound up in the political order of things, and ends up being in a way that you're already, criticizing quietist and lacking, any engagement. And what it seems to me is interesting in all this is that so much of like critical theory in the 20th century, and I know a lot of people are kind of making these kinds of criticisms right now, but it's interesting how so much of the idea is that there's sort of like this rational, technical totality in which everything is assumed. And so then I think that when you believe that, your response is going to be, oh, I have to get outside of it. I have to jump outside the totality, rather than thinking, hey, maybe there really isn't a totality in the way that you're assuming that that's possible. So you shouldn't totally differentiate, because total differentiation actually ends up, being quietist, as opposed to, and this is what's interesting here, thinking like that concession to speak to the public is a form of analogical thinking. It's a way of saying, here's how you see the world, and here's how maybe another way of seeing the world, rather than just saying, hey, I'm making my own world and just trying to walk out. So that kind of analogical form of art making or discourse, I think, is what seems like common sense, but has been missing due to, I think, a certain presupposition of totalitarianism on a political level that's operative everywhere.
Exactly. Yeah, couldn't agree. To see a lot of conversation in later readings that I think you'll find refreshing, because they will flesh out that space that we know exists because it is presumed everywhere in our lives, but really has no representative in contemporary art criticism or art history. So there is an aesthetic language that represents that behavior, and we're going to recover it. So it'll be great. Now, one question that your comment raises, and it's something that I grapple with as well, if there is a position between sort of purely positive and purely negative, between the propagandistic and the critical, we may need a better word than critical. What would we call that space? Other people and at other times may have called it centrist or moderate. I don't think that that's what we mean, because we're still being ambitious, and we're not arriving at a position only because it's between the poles. It's nothing so boring. But how, and you say, well, I wonder if there's a political language that is, say, a vocabulary drawn from political positions that exist that would express that space or speak to that space. I don't know. What do you think? If we can I guess what I'm asking is, can we locate that space ideologically?
I'd be curious what other people. So my background is actually just not to get an introduction or anything, more in philosophy and study of religion, and so I'm developing my political vocabulary in some ways. And I'd be curious if other people, because I don't have an intuitive read on what something like I named the analogical or that kind of critically engaged space.
Yeah.
What someone would. So I'd love to open up for other people if they had some intuition there.
Great.
Perhaps it has to do with like literally opening spaces, like, because sometimes it feels like there's no space to navigate like with a new political language, because it all seems to be like already like commodified. But then maybe you can create like riffs, and by a riff I mean something really specifically, like open up a project space and like try to see what can develop out of it. Because at least in Mexico, like all places for like allow to have like a political conversation, they are always like responding to like bigger orders, and these orders can be like really like obsolete anarchist thoughts, or like institutions that want to have like left-wing talks about Foucault, but that don't actually like allow to anything to appear. So my idea would be that to create new places to talk.
Yeah, so that's an interesting. I think that's an interesting idea that actually I'm going to ask you throughout the rest of the course to keep reminding me of, because my predilection, I think, will be to swing a little too far over to the and give into the temptation to align the aesthetic discussion that we're going to be having with a political discussion that is already very well formed. What you're speaking to is the space for new appearances, which is not utopian per se, because it doesn't involve the sort of hysteria that we saw in some of the manifestos, but it does sort of allow for what Hannah Arendt might call natality, or the new in a non-theological sense, non-apocalyptic sense, and so that's powerful. And well, so here's what I'll say: if we do want to think about somebody, she's not assigned in our reading, but someone like Hannah Arendt, who did want to also keep that space for new appearances open. What was her political terminology? She defended, as I'm sure most of you know, the republic as a style of government. And embedded in that phrase is public. So she found the republic to be a space in which equals would meet, recognize each other as equals, and converse. So that is she regarded that as a legitimately political proposal, but crucially, the aim of that political proposal was only maintaining that public as such. So she offers a model John, maybe to speak to you, some of your point as well, which does not require that we endorse or pursue a set end. What is being pursued for someone like Arendt, and we'll see in a lot of the artists that we talk about actually later, is exchange as such, which I can get into in other weeks as to why that would be valuable. But there's also a sense in which a political commitment can be less ideologically driven, that it can be about the polis, which is the root of politics. Polis being the space in which multiple individuals appear before and engage with one another. That itself, maintaining that space can itself be a political project. That sounds a little esoteric now, but we'll actually start to see people speak that way later in the course. Great, okay, so Patrick, I'm not sure if there was, I think that we may want to do a little bit of housekeeping to prepare for next section. And I'm not sure whether, are people, were meant to take the 2.5 hours without a break, is that right?
Normally, we don't make a break.
Great, that's great, that works for me. Okay, so I think before I'll open space for comments about what you all hope to get out of the course in a moment. But before we do that, to make sure we account for it, I want to just make assignments for next session. And so what I would like, to have happen is have 2 volunteers, and one volunteer will write a short, so no more than 1 page, summary and defense of Michael Gold's essay on proletariat literature. And what I'm looking for there is not so much your interpretation of the text, but just a much more basic account of what Michael Gold thought and why he thought it. And as much as we can, I'd like to present all of the people that we talk about. I want to make sure that we advocate their thinking so that we know, so we give them, best foot forward. That'll allow the variety of voices that we'll be encountering to become most apparent. So I'm looking for one person to just be able to present to the group Michael Gold's essay in a clear, you got it, Eduardo? Great, thank you. And then for a second volunteer, I'd like not a defense of, but a reaction against Gold. And that will be, you can either base that reaction on your own thoughts or what we discussed today, or you can also put to use the second reading, which is, I think, Problems and Perspectives on Revolutionary Literature, which is a very important foundational essay from Partisan Review, a magazine that we will talk about a number of times, a kind of pivotal hinge magazine for American intellectual life in the 20th century. And the essay deals with proletariat literature. I'll give some background on the historical context of those figures and the state of the discussion. But I'd like somebody to write a sort of rejoinder to Michael Gold so that we can just free up the space for our own discussion and make sure that we have for and against sort of available as options when we talk amongst ourselves. So can I see a second volunteer? Artemis, thank you. Great, thanks very much.
Can you please repeat? So the second one, the first assignment, let's say, was the presentation of Michael Gold's. The second is kind of an interpretation, or again, kind of a summary on it, on the second.
Yeah, so you'll be responding to Michael Gold,
Okay.
taking an against position. It's kind of like debate class.
Okay.
So because you're taking a position against it, you can't just summarize the text.
Yeah.
So what you can do is you can either draw on your own impressions, or you can draw on some of the arguments made in the other reading for that week. For
Okay.
revolutionary literature, or problems and perspectives on revolutionary literature, which does take issue with some of what Michael Gold said. So it's up to you. That's great. And so I'm going to have those readings available within the next half hour, 45 minutes. I have the PDF of the Michael Gold ready, and I just need to scan the PDF of the second reading. Those will be available for you very, very shortly. Okay, good. And then for everybody else who is not presenting on a text, we still need to have sort of a small bit of writing performed each session so that we're sure that people are apace. And so what I would like everybody else to do is to just sort of provide a half page of reflections on today's conversation. And the reason that I want that to happen is when you're away from the group, it might free you up to oppose some of what I've been saying. So I think that some of what I presented today was a little polemical, I think by necessity, but I don't want to be dictating the views of the group. So anybody else who wants to write their own half-page account of what we talked about today, that's the task for everybody who's not presenting on a reading, and we'll sort of maintain that structure going forward. Great. Is that clear? I think, Patrick, are there other participants who are not present today?
Yes, there are others who are not currently in this session, but they
I was in touch with one. Yeah, great.
We have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We have 9 in all, and now we only have 5,
Great.
so there should be 4 more.
So should I be concerned that Lindsay and I'm not sure how to pronounce our fifth participant,
Eagle.
Should I be concerned that they're not? Should I assume that they're not able to see this?
I know from Eagle that there was a problem with the audio. And
Okay.
basically, I think that there's a problem from the audio coming to here, and I will just send an email to everybody that, yeah.
Oh, okay. Lindsay is saying that she can hear just fine. Thank you. Great.
So,
okay.
So if you want, we have all assignments already done. Other than that, I could always, there's always the possibility if somebody has no microphone working, that I can reiterate it. They just have to write it in the group chat, and then I'll just present that as their.
I'll send an email recapitulating the assignment for everybody who wasn't here. But that's good. Good to know. Thank you, Patrick, for being willing to do that. And so actually, in the end, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. In the end, to wrap up the session. I would love to hear, I thought we wouldn't be able to get to introductions, but I would love to hear from each of you sort of like who you are, what your what you're doing these days, what your interest is in the course, and what you hope to get out of the course, how the course would be productive for you. Artemisa, do you mind starting?
Yes. So I'm an architect. I was also kind of ready to comment on that because I was wondering, I was reading an interview of the new director of AA, Architecture Association, Eva Frange-Gillebert is the new one. And she was saying this exact thing, how architects now, either unemployed in my country at least, or I come from Greece, or they are just silent in their own avant-gardism, and what can we do now to move forward? And yeah, she was responding about her new position as a director of an institution that has a long history and a lot of influence in the architecture world. So I was wondering, in each of our disciplines in architecture, for me is architecture, how we can do not just work and get involved first through the institutions and through the academics, or in a third way, with the public, as we said, how the avant-garde works. We use the institution, but at the same time we need to invent new ways of conflicts and communication. Yes.
That's fascinating. Thank you. So you're in Greece. Are you a practicing architect?
Well, I just came from New York. I was working there.
Great.
3 months in Karim Rashid, and now I'm just wondering how I continue, because this was actually the reason I got into the new center, the critical philosophy, and I'm now searching maybe to move to France. I was there also some years ago, or moving forward. I'm interested in getting a PhD. So in this year, I will continue doing my work, but at the same time getting involved as much as I can in the thinking without being isolated in my world. That's my plan.
Good. That's fascinating. I'll be interested to hear what's compelling about the anecdote that you gave, coming from an architect, is architecture is a discipline that has practical obligations, to create spaces that will be occupied by others. And so I'll be very interested to hear sort of that field-specific view come forward in your comments in the coming weeks. I'm also very interested in how, architecture is a fascinating field because it sort of straddles the entire spectrum that we were discussing. On the one hand, there's the practical obligation. On the other hand, there's the trend toward schematism, things remaining a blueprint only. In some ways, architecture is the most utopian field of them all. Tatlin's Tower is unavailable reference in that regard. So I'm interested I'll be interested to hear from you, obviously throughout the rest of the course. Thank you. Eduardo, do you have a quick introduction?
I'm from Mexico City. I'm a filmmaker, mainly. I have made very abstract work in the past, but I lately felt this need to create more explicit work that can engage in a more explicit way with the people. And also I have participated at some festivals, but I have realized film festival is a really sterile platform because it's only self-consuming. For this reason, I lately I've been thinking how I can operate in other areas, and thinking how would I appropriate a gallery space. But then again, even if I know the people running the art space in Mexico, it's not I'm interested in participating in their specific games. So I would like to think how to maybe either create my own space or get a gallery space for a month and create a lot of activities happening there, more than just exhibiting a video or another piece. So try something in how to de-sterilize the art situation, at least from my practice, and maybe to find some collectivity rather to just being me making the work.
Did you say de-etherealize?
De-sterilize, fight sterility.
Oh, de-sterilize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
De-sterilize.
Sorry. Great. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, interesting. So the perspective of a practicing artist is always more than welcome. Of course, I think that it's such a your much like Artemis in Greece, your perspective on what's happening in Mexico, I think will also be very fascinating. I actually wonder if you could speak to, you mentioned before the sort of irony of the socialist government in Mexico's relationship to art funding. Could you, I would just love to hear another like 2 or 3 sentences about that.
Okay, so the socialist government is just starting, but like we've been in like some sort of dictatorship for like 100 years with like the same party governing everything and whatever. And those were the party that were really able to commodify any sort of critique inside their own like scheme. Like there's this situation with like third world cinema, like third cinema, in which like you have like these Bolivian guys or Argentinian guys making really radical films, but like the counterpart in Mexico is really commodified. It's just like it was appropriated by the government right away and like given money by. But then with this change we're seeing, like it's really interesting because like people that are getting empowered in the cultural world is like contemporary artists, like, and like really famous ones are like going to take like government positions. And with this, the problem is like, it seems like it's going to get like stabilized somehow that I cannot figure right now, but you can feel how like people that used to be critic of the old order are starting to like get neutralized inside this new order.
Yeah, bought off.
Well,
they're being bought off.
Yeah. And like there's no possibility for criticality in the actual spaces right now because like all these people is like comfortable with this new situation because they're going to get rich or whatever. And
so this is so do you, sorry, this is a much broader question, but
yeah,
this so this is happening under the banner of the new socialist government. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just curious because these terms mean something very different in the American context. Only Republicans regard socialism in America as totalitarian. When we use the term socialism, we tend to mean social democratic and link it to the New Deal. It doesn't have the totalitarian implications that it does for Central, South America, and some parts of Europe. So I wonder if you could just relate the current socialist government, the new socialist government, to its predecessors who were dictators. Are they the same in a practical sense?
It feels like the same.
Okay, so that's very sobering. You will also find much that is compelling in the readings going forward. The virtues and vices of socialism, both from a European and an American perspective, are going to be hot topics in our readings. And the propensity of socialism to slip into dictatorship, although it has become a kind of boogeyman in contemporary American discourse, was very real for earlier generations of American critics and intellectuals. And so you'll hear a lot that will seem, unfortunately, familiar in our readings. So I look forward to hearing your contemporary take on those period writings as well. And thank you. Great. We're not going to hear from Eagle. John, you said a few words about yourself earlier. I wonder if you could just pad that out a little bit.
Yeah, so my background is in the study of religion, history and philosophy of religion, and
what's that?
I currently am applying to get into PhD programs down the road. So that's kind of the hope as of right now, like a PhD in philosophy or of religions, interested in method and theory and questions of comparativism.
John, there is a problem with your audio. We can't hear you.
Yeah, John, you're sort of
Now,
timing.
I'm finding that
Okay, great.
this question of how to be constructive.
John, can you downgrade your bandwidth? There's a picture. There's a symbol. It's called adjust bandwidth usage.
Be positive rather than just is then what happens you know, when we feel like, oh, I need to take responsibility for building a world rather than just negating, rather than just pushing, rather than always trying to be on the outside. And so this question also for me is related to questions of rationalism and mysticism and religion, because there's a certain kind of religious aesthetic operative throughout many world religions that, you know, pulls on the avant-garde in a way. There's something there I'm interested in thinking about the question of power and obfuscation, or power and a lack of intelligibility, and how you can use that to control people. And yeah, this question of how do we create new trajectories? How do we open up spaces, sort of like what we were talking about earlier, new spaces for action and understanding and art, in a way that's not phobic of creating a new world, you know? And just being aware of, like, you know, the avant-garde has this constructive element, but it also has this fascistic element, which you already pointed out quite well. So I don't really have a well-defined answer. I'm just sort of exploring these kinds of intersections right now.
You came to the right place. Fantastic. I think what you'll find is that a lot of those questions that you're raising are, if not completely answered, they're acknowledged in some of the American pragmatic thinkers that will be accounting sort of at second and third hand through some of our readings. A lot of the participants and contributors to Partisan Review, which again, we're going to read sort of 3 or 4 readings from, were taught by an American pragmatist named Sidney Hook, who was a professor at CUNY and then at NYU, who was in turn one of the star pupils of John Dewey. And so ideas of world building, of, again, we have to find a less boring term, of moderation. They would call it reform.
Yeah.
Some of those themes will get picked up in an American pragmatic vernacular later on. Yeah, interesting. Great. Oh, Lindsay's back. Hello, Lindsay. Oh,
Hi.
yeah. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So full disclosure, I'm just dropping in on this session. Jaden texted me to remind me that I might be interested. So okay. I just want to let you know I won't be participating, but thank you for this first session. This was great. So I have a doctorate in philosophy. I worked primarily on George Bataille's notion of non-knowledge. So I think the reason also Jaden was encouraging me to participate in this is that I'm also a writer, and I'm publishing a novel this year with an avant-garde press. So I guess you could say I work as an avant-garde artist. But then I do translation work as well. And I'm currently teaching an outreach philosophy course at a community college where I live. An outreach course is sort of, it's designed to reach the students for whom even a community college course would be difficult to afford. So, so it's an intro to ethics course, but it's quite interesting because it's primarily EMTs and nurses. So, yeah, I think they might need the course to advance their degrees. But so I'm sort of just occupying all these different worlds.
Fascinating.
You know, figuring out. Thanks.
Sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Nothing important.
Oh, it's all very important. It's super fascinating. It's a shame that you won't be with us for the next couple of weeks. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off in any way. Oh, what is the course? What's on the syllabus for the course?
Well, unfortunately, that is fixed. So, I don't get to control any of that. The state where I live, it's the state of Virginia. They have a very strict control of what's taught in the community colleges. So, it's like we start out with Socrates and then we move on to Mill and Kant. And so it's not uninteresting stuff. It's just a little bit more of a challenge to make it relevant and accessible, I think, for the students.
Great. Well, thanks for sitting in today. And as I said, sorry to miss you in the coming weeks. And congratulations on the novel.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this. This is great.
Sure. Okay, so I think that's pretty clear. If anybody wants to say what they hope to get out of the course, I'm very open to structuring the coming weeks. Of course, I've kind of committed to a certain story, but I'm open to shaping the coming sessions to your needs. So if there's anything that you want to get that you don't see reflected in the syllabus, or that I could in any way help you with, I'm happy to make the time valuable to you, kind of in a bespoke way. So that's kind of quite a vague question, but I just wanted to extend the offer. So if nobody has any comments, oh, John, were you gonna say something? Okay. If nobody has any comments, then I think that's a natural place to wrap things up. We're about 9 minutes shy, but we can always take that time to reflect. Patrick, do you have any remarks from a technical standpoint?
I mean, when we have all the students inside the classroom, we can talk about things like what you can do if somebody has a problem with their bandwidth usage, meaning like with John before, there's the possibility to throttle your bandwidth. Like I can turn off my mic, like you can't hear me anymore, and I can turn off the video, which is the button just right next to it, and I can throttle the bandwidth. This is the button right next to it. It's like this small mountain. And if you have a really, really awful connection, you can throttle it, and I'll do it because I'm the moderator. I will do it for all of you. So just so you see, if I throttle it completely down, we only have forced audio and no longer video. But you all can do this for yourself. If you see that something, it's the audio is getting stuttery, the video is getting choppy, I always tell you throttle it down, because then the audio doesn't get throttled down. The audio just flows through, and it's nice to have video, but I'd rather have no video and wonderful pristine audio than having to ask you every third minute to reiterate what you just said because we couldn't hear it.
That sounds like a decent trade-off. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
And other than that,
fantastic. So I will send an email to the group with reiterating the terms of the assignment for next week, both for our two principal presenters and for the rest of the students who will all be respondents, and also with the texts themselves attached. So expect that within the next hour. Okay. Thanks to you all. I had a great time in this first session, and I just couldn't be more excited for the next 7 weeks.
Superb.
Okay, great. So I'll just leave.
You just leave.